Hi, I'm Al Musella. I'm the president of the Musella Foundation for Brain Tumor Research and Information Incorporated. I'm here today to talk to you about the Promising Pathway Act. I might refer to it as PPA later in the presentation. I feel this is the most significant legislation for brain cancer and other rare diseases that we have ever had. This is going to make a major impact quickly. It's going to affect you. New drugs could be approved in time to help people who are dealing with these diseases right now. It creates a new pathway to FDA approval. It'll drastically reduce the time and money needed to get new treatments approved. It'll dramatically accelerate the search for the cure, and it increases the amount of research done on treatment compared to the current pathways, but moves most of the research to after approval instead of before. It will allow for access to many new drugs. I'm picturing that we could probably get 5 to 10 new brain tumor drugs within the first few months of this bill passing, which allows your doctors to create combinations now. Under the current system, it's very difficult to create combinations that involve experimental drugs. All patients using these treatments will be tracked in a registry, so we learn how useful each new treatment is and how the combinations are performing. How you can help. We need your help getting this bill passed. Just go to virtualtrials.com and click on the action alert. That'll take you to virtualtrials.com/activism.cfm and fill out the form. It'll literally take 1 minute or less to just fill it out and send it to all your legislators. You could have everybody in your family do it and then tell all your friends and family to do it and mention it on social media. Background. I got started with brain tumors back in 1992 when my sister-in-law was diagnosed with glioblastoma. Back then, believe it or not, things were even worse than they are now. That was before the days of Timidar and Optune and Gamatile and all these other good things that we have now. As a matter of fact, back then there was no centralized listing of treatment options either. There was no online anything because Netscape was introduced in that year, and that started the World Wide Web. So there was nothing. I started the first online support group for brain tumors, and we had a lot of members. My first project was to get each of them to survey all the major hospitals in their area and just find out what the treatment options are. Clinical trials, even the standard treatments or off-label things. We created a nice database and we put it on our website. And it was actually so interesting that the NIH came to us and modeled clinicaltrials.gov off of our database. The second project we did is now we had all these treatment options. So there were basically 100 different clinical trials with a mess of words that nobody could understand. So we had to figure out which ones were the best. So I started a project which I call the Brain Tumor Virtual Trial. It's a registry of brain tumor patients, the treatments they do, and the outcome. And the concept was we were going to just observe everybody who had a brain tumor, see what treatments they did, and see which ones did better than others so we could figure out which are the best treatments. And hopefully identify a new treatment as soon as possible so that other people can benefit from it. That project is still going on. My sister-in-law unfortunately died about 8.5 years later, which for her, for a person with a GBM back then, that was unheard of. Her doctors told her that there was absolutely no treatment options left and that she was going to die within 6 months or so. And we found a few different treatment options, including clinical trials that would accept her that her doctors didn't even know about. So I got involved in this. We heavily involved. My father was then diagnosed in 1999. Unfortunately, he only lived 6 months. So I have a stake in this. I'm not just an outside observer. So for over the years, we put together different programs. Our current program right now, we have a collaboration between my organization, Cancer Commons, and a company called XCures, which I'm a very small owner of. I own less than 0.5%. Together, we have a project that's listed on clinicaltrials.gov where we look at a patient's records, and we have a team of nurse navigators, research scientists, and medical doctors who put together the best plan options for each patient. We then give them to the patient and the doctor. The patient and the doctor decide which ones they want to do. They could use our ideas or not. But in any case, we observe the outcome. We observe what treatments they wind up doing, the reasoning for that, and how it works out. And that way we learn from each individual patient. Unfortunately, most of the options that we come up with are impossible to do because they involve experimental treatments, and we can't get either access to the experimental treatment or permission to combine these experimental treatments. So we use the best plan option that is available, which is unfortunate. This bill will allow us to do all the plan options that we want. We'll be able to create plan options of 5 to 10 different treatments, and your doctors can create their own cocktails and test them in our system. And we'll home in on the cure as fast as possible, much faster than under the current system. That sounds really good, but surprisingly, not everybody supports this bill. There are a couple cons to it. It will have a large negative financial impact on some large companies, medical centers, and some doctors. Because currently, if you're in a phase 3 clinical trial, when you go to a hospital, they get paid about $50,000 to $100,000 per patient per year to observe you in the clinical trial. And they may have hundreds of people in the clinical trial, so it winds up adding up to a lot of money. This may get rid of most of that. Some large drug companies who are charging $40,000 to $50,000 a month for their treatments might not be able to do that if we have new treatments that work as well that are much less expensive. So some people are going to be losers, but my main concern here is the patient, and that's the most important thing. And finally, the wording of the bill is not perfect. We had the perfect words in the original draft of the bill, but we had to compromise a little to have a chance of approval. It's still a huge step forward, but with a little ambiguity in there, we might have to fight to get exactly what we want. So the fight's not over just by getting this approved. We have to just push them just a little bit to make sure it gets implemented the right way. The original version of the bill said we only need 50 patients to prove safety before it gets approved. Now it has some vague wording about efficacy, and we'll get to that. There's a few problems that people keep bringing up, such as won't bad drugs get approved? Yes, definitely. That's expected, and we actually hope for it because with the registry, after a few patients using it, nobody else will use it. We learn from every patient's experience. So after the first 40 patients come into the project, come in using that treatment, and they're not doing well, nobody else in their right mind is going to prescribe it. Patients just won't be using it, and it will be ended. So a company would have to spend a few $1,000,000 to get to that point, and if it's not good enough, it's just not going to get used. Currently, there are alternative treatments being touted that claim to have treated thousands of brain tumor patients. There are GoFundMe pages everywhere raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund patients for these with nobody overseeing the outcomes. With the registry, we quickly find out if they help or not and can prevent thousands from making the same mistake over and over. People call me every single day and ask me about these clinics in different countries and even here in the United States. And I have to tell you, we just don't have enough information one way or the other. I can't tell them, no, it's not good. But again, I can't say it's good because we just have no idea, which is fine if it's a few patients. But if it's 1,000 patients, that's completely insane. This system will prevent that because every patient's tracked. And don't we need phase 3 trials? No. Clinicaltrials.gov reports there was 39 phase 3 glioblastoma trials that were completed since they started keeping records. Of these, only 2 had positive results, which were, of course, Temodar and Optune. That means there were 36, I'm sorry. There's 36 negative trials, which makes no sense because to get to a phase 3 trial, usually an earlier phase trial had to show good enough results to allow them to put that much money into a phase 3 trial. Phase 3 trials are very expensive. So to get to that point, there had to be some proof that the drug is relatively safe and has some effect. But the problem is they can't really be used in the correct ways. Once the clinical trial protocol is set up, it's rigid and you can't change it without basically starting all over again. So if you think you're starting off with a vaccine and then a few months later you realize a checkpoint inhibitor would have helped, you can't just add it in. You have to basically start a new arm or start again. There is an exception. There's a couple new trials starting up that are a little more flexible, but it's really too little too late. Um, and these phase 3 trials, even all the ones that failed, most of them had some patients that were helped by the treatment, but the median survivals did not change, so the treatments were tossed away. In other words, they didn't figure out who would benefit from them in time to save the treatments, resulting in many important drugs no longer being available. There's many, many, many examples of this. I was involved in a few of the FDA meetings where they were discussed. And one particular case with a name I really shouldn't mention, the trial itself had no increase in median survival. However, there was 4 subgroups that really, really made sense that had remarkable improvements, like 50 to 150% increases in survival or progression-free survival. The FDA's answer was, instead of approving it, they said, we need you to do another large phase 3 trial to prove that these subgroups are actually true. This treatment had absolutely no side effects, and some people had amazing responses on MRI, and some lived a lot longer than they should have. And the FDA wanted them to repeat probably another 3 to 5 years trial that would have cost $50 million. And the company just didn't have the money. They gave up and closed down, and now the treatment is no longer available. This bill might be able to resurrect a few of those drugs. Then they say, how can you trust real-world data compared to a clinical trial? And in the bill, we say that we could use endpoints that are not previously validated. They're like, what are you talking about? So a randomized controlled trial is only really needed to spot small differences in outcome when you can only test a small percentage of the patients. If you could test every patient, you don't really have to randomize because you could compare them directly. And if you're looking for a large difference, which is what we want, it should be relatively easy to spot. There's advanced statistics now. We have an advanced team on working with us that say they can pick out which drugs in a multi-drug regimen are actually working when they have enough data. They use the same techniques on Wall Street to figure out how certain things affect stock prices, and it's the same type of math. This is current math, whereas the old system is using math that's 100 years old. And real-world data can be just as reliable, if not more, because it's reported from many different sources, many different hospitals, many different doctors, not just from the people who have the financial interest in the result. That's especially true of these trials that are only done in one center. Most of the phase 3 trials are multi-center for that reason. But even when they're multi-center, sometimes they're only 2, 3, 4 centers. And sometimes the people do have a financial interest in the result. Whereas once the drug is approved, it doesn't matter anymore. There's no financial interest in this. As to the endpoints, it's difficult to officially validate an endpoint. You have to go through a study to validate an endpoint. And that's something that we should be doing as a society, and we're not. But for a drug company to do that, it's not practical. It just takes too many years and too much work and too much money. We're talking about endpoints that just make sense, such as the percentage of patients able to work or go to school at 6 and 12 months. That's not an official an official endpoint, but I think it should be. We have some drugs, including one of the failed trials that I saw all the information on. They had people working at high-level jobs 3 and 4 years later in the treatment group, whereas they had none in the control group. To me, that's an important endpoint and should have got approved, but they didn't get approved and the company dissolved, and you could never get the drug ever again. I'm working on a project now with an experimental drug with children, where we're seeing kids going back to school a year after they should have been dead, which to me is a very important endpoint. Because even with the current treatments, when a kid does manage to live over the year, none of them are really going to school. So how can approving more treatment save money? If you're having a 5-drug combination, isn't that going to be ridiculously expensive? Currently, the official estimate to take a drug through the approval process from phase 1 to 2 to phase 3 and then approval, and where you end the research, except on the accelerated approval where you have to do some more research for cancer, Cost over $1.2 billion in 8 years. That's a lot of money. Picture having a scientist, and I do this all the time. I've given out hundreds of research grants, where basic research grants, where a doctor thinks they have something that's good to use as a treatment, but it never gets into people because they have to convince somebody to pay for that. And not just this first small little trial, they have to think ahead and say, are we going to be able to raise $1 billion and wait 8 years to get money back on our investment based on this drug? Is it that good? And basically, no drug is that good anymore. My thoughts are we need to get the building blocks of a cocktail approved so that even if you have drugs that are not good enough to be the home run on their own, combined they will be. And under the current system, you just can't get those things approved. So the PPA can cut that to perhaps $5 million in 2 years. There's a huge difference between $5 million in 2 years and $1.2 billion in 8 years. It's a lot easier to get the investment. This will be a phase 1 to a relatively small phase 2, get approval, and then you have more research with the registry. And every patient's going to be tracked in the registry until you prove that it works, or 6 years, whichever comes first. If you can't prove it within 6 years, you lose the approval and you have to go back to the old method of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 approval. And this is going to break the monopoly. If you have possibly 10 to 20 new treatments relatively soon, hopefully within the first year, they could compete on price if the efficacy is all the same. Hopefully, if one is much better than all the others, we'll use that, and that might be expensive. But if you have 5 drugs that all work about the same, they're going to be competing on price. And you never had that before in the brain tumor or any other cancer market, really. Then they say, how can you figure out combinations without rigid trials? Rigid trials, with 5 different drugs, it will take a lot of trials to figure out the optimal combination because you have to set them up in advance, and it takes years and a lot of money to do each combination. And it's just difficult. Here, any doctor can come up with their own combination, which they have done in the past. But the key is, in the past, when doctors came up with their own combinations, nobody was overseeing it and collecting the results. So you had groups of doctors all over the country trying the same experiment, and even if they all failed, nobody else knew. So another group of doctors would start up the same thing. Here, we track all of them. So the doctors could look into the database and say, oh, that was tried already and didn't work. Let's try something else. The Musella Foundation has a program where a team of doctors and research scientists figure out these combinations right now. I mentioned part of it before. We look at the medical records and give the plan options and all that stuff. It's listed on clinical trials at this web address. We set up these virtual trials. Our team can do it, and any team of doctors or any doctor individually can do it, and they could propose it. And they could do it among themselves or their friends or their hospital and use the infrastructure of the registry. It doesn't have to be our registry. It could be anybody's registry. And it'll be quick and easy to do these tests. It's impossible to do it right now because you can't combine these outside the trial just yet. So I think we could easily figure out the combinations, which ones are working, which ones are not working, which ones are safe, which ones are not safe, pretty quickly, having the whole country and even actually the world working together instead of in small little silos. So, summary of the PPA. It speeds up access to experimental drugs, speeds up the search for the cure, vastly increases the amount of research, lowers or at least holds level the cost of new drugs, allows doctors to be creative again instead of following a protocol that has been proven thousands of times not to work. So go to virtualtrials.com to send letters. Thank you.